Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar titled Beyond the Payer Perspective, Innovative Approaches to Capture Patient and Community Insights in Value Assessment. I'd like to start off by thanking our friends at CEVR for organizing and co-hosting today's event. My name is Matt Sussman. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Strategy. We are a boutique and integrated HEOR and market access consulting firm located in Boston. That's my day job. My night job is I'm the current ISPOR Boston chapter president. I'm joined by our board of directors, which is a fantastic group of collegial and collaborative team members, most of whom are here today. And just quickly, in terms of the ISPOR Boston chapter, who we are and what we do, we try to educate, bring together folks in these types of forums, whether they're webinars or in-person events. But really the goal is to help share knowledge really across the industry. We also act as mentors for individuals who are interested in the things in our field, HEOR practices, market access practices, and so on and so forth. And finally, we serve as a bridge and bring together members of our ecosystem. We have a wide group of folks in the Boston area, and we try to serve as networking members for, again, those folks in our ecosystem. Just in terms of becoming involved, we do ask that folks register for membership. On our LinkedIn page, we do have a form that's pinned to the top of the page. Folks should visit that form and complete it in order to receive emails about social events, networking events, and educational events such as this. And you can also feel free to follow us both on LinkedIn and also on Twitter. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Patty.
Thanks, Matt. It's really a pleasure to get the opportunity to introduce today's speakers. They represent a really distinguished group of experts on this topic. So kicking things off, we'll have Rick Chapman. Rick is the Chief Science Officer at the Innovation and Value Initiative, or IVI. He will be describing a project to advance understanding of patient-centered outcomes in rare disease. Second, we'll have Tara Lavelle. She will share insights from an effort to measure the health, quality of life, and productivity of bereaved parents of children who have died from spinal muscular atrophy. Tara is an assistant professor at CEVR, the Center for the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health at Tufts Medical Center. And then following Tara, we will have Brett McQueen, who's an associate professor at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. He also directs the Center for Pharmaceutical Value, which is also known as P-Value. Brett will talk about incorporating the perspectives of patients and their families into negotiations and affordability reviews. There is some time reserved at the end of their talks for questions, so please use the Q&A function in your Zoom window. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Rick.
Thanks, Patty and Matt, and thanks to the ISPOR Boston chapter and CEVR for hosting this talk. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a project that we've recently completed the first phase of, which is related to engaging patients for in rare diseases to find out what outcomes are important to them. And I just want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen right now and you're seeing my slides.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, great. So this is a project that we did funded by, in part by PCORI and in part by Alexion Pharmaceuticals. And it's a project we did in partnership with the Every Life Foundation for Rare Diseases. And Annie Kennedy kind of co-chaired the project throughout and was a great partner for us. So I'm talking a little bit about the objectives of the project and what we did in the project. So this was really the impetus for this project was that I'd been involved with value assessments for rare disease treatments And it's seen all the ways that health technology assessment really struggles with rare diseases. And for all the reasons we know, the gaps and challenges in rare disease outcomes data and research, there's often a lot of uncertainty around the disease itself and the treatments, and also around what outcomes matter to patients. And so I'd seen patient groups and other stakeholders try to scramble to come up with some of this information to help inform value assessments. But often it would be too late by the time we got to that point to really have meaningful input into the process. And so really wanted to think about, are there ways we could streamline the process of patient engagement so that we're starting this earlier and doing it in a more systematic way to make sure that we're helping to fill in some of these gaps, or at least have some systematic understanding of where those gaps are going to be, so that we're not having to do that kind of scrambling at the end. So we started this project to bring together different stakeholders, including patients and their families, researchers, and healthcare providers, to really think about what are some new approaches to looking at outcomes and comparative effectiveness research for rare diseases. So to do that, we did a targeted lit review as part of this to look at where there are gaps and challenges, and looking not just at outcomes for rare diseases, but also patient engagement processes and what has been put out there about that. We also worked with a steering committee, multi-stakeholder steering committee, and 3 roundtable sessions to start to think about what are the range of outcomes that are important to patients and caregivers in rare diseases. And specifically, could we look for outcomes that cut across certain rare diseases, so that when we come to a new disease, we're not starting from scratch, but we can look at maybe analogous diseases and see what outcomes have been important there. And then really try to come up with some priority steps to start to address some of these challenges and come up with a real approach to patient engagement. This first phase of the project, we recently completed and published a report on our key themes and recommendations that came out of that report. And you can find that report on our website. This is really kind of a busy slide, but it's really just to show that we had multiple opportunities for different stakeholders to be involved. And we tried to make sure that we had multiple stakeholder input throughout the process. And it importantly made sure that we had multiple patient and caregiver voices around the table to make sure that we're hearing different perspectives that different patients may have there. It was also a good exercise in terms of, I'm always struck when we have these kinds of roundtables, how seldom these different stakeholders really do sit around a table and talk to each other and hear what their pain points are. And especially the second roundtable, we focused on a payer perspective and really tried to have several payer representatives there. And the patients, I think, really appreciated hearing how payers think about rare diseases. And really, we're looking for more of those types of engagements. So after we went through this process of the lit review and meetings with our steering committee and roundtables, there were several key themes that came out, and we were able to categorize those themes into certain domains, and I'll talk about some of those. We also came up with a list of recommendations and tried to prioritize those. So I'll go through the recommendations that were prioritized by our stakeholders. And then finally, through the lit review and discussions with patients, started to try to identify some common patient-centered outcomes that may cut across rare diseases. And so I'll talk about those briefly as well. So first, the key themes, as I said, those really fell into certain domains that we could categorize them into. One thing that came through clearly was the importance of the patient journey and paying attention to where in the patient journey that they were over time, and that patients and also the caregiver journey was another thing that came out. And patients and caregivers really emphasized that you can't just do a snapshot and figure out what's important to them, that what's important varies not only across patients and across families, but also within patients and families over time. Where they are in their patient journey really influences which outcomes are going to matter to them. And that kind of fit in with the next theme, which was really around the need for early and continuing engagement and communication. Patients told us over and over again that they often feel like when they're involved in these processes, they're brought in as sort of a check the box exercise and to rubber stamp decisions that have already been made, and really emphasize that they wanted to be part of that decision-making process and involved early enough that they can really influence what we're looking at in these types of assessments. Data and methods, of course, for rare disease is something that comes up. Lots of data gaps, everything from the natural history of disease to what matters to patients and the outcomes, economic impacts, and so on. And the need for better methods to incorporate, places where we have data gaps or places where we may not have quantitative data, but we have some qualitative data. So talked about the need to incorporate that and mixed methods research in terms of dealing with the assessments for rare diseases. Economic impacts was something that came up, and really in a much broader way than we often think about it. They went beyond the healthcare cost to them and their families, and even beyond, productivity and work issues that we often think about, to emphasize that there are broader economic impacts that may cause issues for families and patients, and that those are very often not captured. Also, there was, again, an emphasis that those economic impacts change over time, and so we have to pay attention to where patients are in their journey to think about that, as well as think about, we can't just look at an average patient here. We really have to think about patients who are facing different circumstances and how the economics may be different for them in those different circumstances. Scientific spillovers was an area that was mentioned of special importance in rare diseases, and that we should recognize that as a public good and put some value around that. And then finally, identifying the common patient-centered outcomes that I'll come to later. So some of the recommendations, we had more recommendations than we could really put into a small list or an actionable list. So we really asked the stakeholders that we're working with to rank each of these in terms of both the feasibility of doing them and the urgency of doing them, and recognizing that those could be very different in terms of how we approach different recommendations. And I'll go through a few of those now. Here, the ones that we really did prioritize by domain. So around the patient journey and time, it was to emphasize that we need to include outcomes that are meaningful across the patient journey. And that includes looking at time to diagnosis, which is often very long for rare diseases, age at diagnosis, the severity of disease, and delays in treatment or time spent on treatment and caregiving, that those are all things that need to be captured. In terms of engagement and communication, I mentioned already, begin patient and caregiver engagement earlier. It's too late by the time we get to close to product launch or close to the time we're doing health technology assessments. And to think about innovative ways to engage patients, such as virtual engagement strategies or other ways to bring them in. Normalizing the patient presence throughout the research agenda was considered very important, again, to avoid that feeling that they're just being brought in to check the box and say that we did patient engagement. And this was something that came out, especially in discussions with payers, that we need more dedicated resources to achieving these kinds of direct patient interactions. One of the things that the payers said is they really would like to have more patient input, but often feel like they're not being given the resources to do that. In terms of data, that we need to include caregiver perspectives as well as patients, recognize the unique data challenges of rare diseases, and make allowance for that in our processes, whether that's using qualitative data or other methods. And utilize data sources beyond clinical trials, including real-world data sources. In terms of methods, to consider the natural history of rare diseases and incorporate patient-centered outcomes in assessments and prior authorization criteria. So not just using those patient-centered outcomes to look at clinical effectiveness, but also to think about how we design coverage policies to make sure that we're keeping those in mind. Economic impacts account for variations in patients' conditions and the differences in personal circumstances that they may bring to their disease, and design studies to capture those broad economic impacts. Scientific spillover, we should keep in mind and develop methods to evaluate the potential for scientific spillover effects, and funders and policymakers, we think, should factor in that the scientific spillover, that's a public good that comes out of this, and consider that when they're making funding decisions. And then finally, around identifying patient-centered outcomes, to really start early to design interviews, design surveys and conduct interviews with patients and caregivers and other stakeholders to make sure we're getting a full patient-centered perspective. Utilize existing frameworks. There's some out there that are designed for more common diseases, and you can see that a lot of these things would apply to rare and non-rare diseases equally. So we should think about how to apply those to rare diseases and where we may need to modify those. And then one thing is to form authentic patient partnerships with patient groups and rare disease advocacy groups, so that we have that kind of trusted relationship before we get to the point where we're trying to scramble to do these assessments, and try to build that trust at that point. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the patient-centered outcomes that we found in our lit review. We're planning to expand this work in the next phase, but these are some of the things. We did a targeted search for 10 specific rare diseases, and these were outcomes that came up across more than half of those. And some of those you'd expect, like physical functioning or mental health, mental deterioration issues. And then there are others that maybe we don't think about as often: pain, fatigue, and sleep, which I think cut across rare diseases and a lot of more common diseases as well. But then there were some things that I think don't often come up, or come up as often, that patients cared about, which was what were the outcomes in terms of social relationships? How are those being impacted by a disease or treatment? Employment and work, and this went beyond just looking at productivity losses, but also thinking about employment decisions that may have to be changed, or career trajectories that may change for patients or their families because of the disease or the caregiving they have to do. And how do we capture those kind of broader impacts and the economic impacts that I talked about earlier? So kind of our conclusions to come out of this is that researchers really need to be proactive in terms of identifying these patient-centered outcomes and making sure that we're ready when we come to look at treatments for these diseases. Earlier collaboration with patients, caregivers, and advocacy groups throughout the drug development process. Don't forget the caregivers and the families of patients, that we need to really pay attention to them, especially for rare diseases that often impact children. And, to really continuously advocate for research on outcomes that are important to patients, and collect these over time, so that we're not waiting till the last minute to try to figure out how to include this information. Next steps, as I mentioned, we've published a report with our key themes and recommendations out of this phase of the work, and you can find that on our website, and I encourage you to go to look at that. We're planning to publish the results from our lit review. And then we're going into the next phase of this, where we're really going to talk about how do we implement some of these recommendations. And so what we want to come up with is a blueprint or a checklist that researchers and other stakeholders can use when they're thinking about how to evaluate rare diseases and identify outcomes that are important to patients. And if there's anybody here who's interested in being part of that work, you could please reach out to us and let us know. My email is provided here, and we'd welcome people. We're just assembling the advisory group for that next phase of the project right now. So now would be a great time. And I know we're going to have questions later, but for now, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lavelle.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my slides here. Okay, can everyone see my slides okay? I'll take that as a yes. All right, hi everyone. Thanks, Dr. Chapman, for that really interesting presentation. I think that we're going to hit on some of the themes that you identified in your talk, and glad to see there's a lot of work in this area moving forward. So I'm going to be presenting some preliminary results from a study that we did assessing outcomes for parents that are bereaved from spinal muscular atrophy. So the focus of this project was on assessing outcomes for parents bereaved from spinal muscular atrophy, which I'll refer to as SMA during this presentation. And we focused on SMA type 1, which is it's the most serious form of SMA. It impacts the ability for children to breathe, eat, and walk. Prior to the treatments that started to come out about 8 years ago, the average life expectancy for a child diagnosed with SMA type 1 was less than 2 years. Most children live to be about 1. There's currently no cure for SMA, but there have been several new treatments that have come out, like I mentioned. And what we're going to think about or talk about today is not only the impact that SMA has on the child, but also on the family. So the focus of this talk is not to really talk about any one therapy, but just to acknowledge that it's going to be really important as new treatments for rare diseases and other diseases that extend the life of patients that have significant, family involvement, that it's really important that we think about the methods that we're using to value these new treatments. And for the presentation today, I'm going to focus on 2 related questions based on some preliminary analyses that we did in this for this study. And the full results should be available in a few months in a paper that we're currently working on. So the first question is, how does grief impact parent quality of life and work productivity? And the second question is, what are the implications of this impacts on quality of life and work productivity for economic evaluations? And I'll start with this first question. So the objective of this part of the study was to measure the impact of parent grief, like I said, on several different outcomes, but I'll focus on quality of life and work productivity. And the study population was parents that were bereaved following the death of a child with SMA type 1. So we started this study by doing qualitative interviews. And this was with parents of children who had died from SMA. And we used the information that we gathered from the qualitative interviews to develop a survey. So we interviewed 16 bereaved parents about their experience caring for their child, the context of the child's death, and then the impact of grief on their quality of life, work, and social connections. So I'm just going to show a few of the quotes that we gathered from the qualitative work. The first one is related to the initial shock of the diagnosis, where one parent said that the day of the diagnosis was probably the hardest day of my life. And this was a very common theme that I didn't expect going into this, but is obviously these are the types of things that us as researchers really learned from these patients, that for these parents, this was the hardest part, was actually getting the diagnosis. Related to that, one parent said to me, it's not the death, it's all the lost potential, a child who never really got to live. And then related to the parents' quality of life and social connection, one parent said there's some days that you could just talk about it without crying, and then other days that just flood. So sort of talking about the normal sort of nonlinear trajectory of grief that most parents mentioned. And as far as social connections go, my friends basically all went away. I think they just don't know how to relate. And this was a very common theme, that parents seem to develop really strong connections to other parents who had who either had a child with SMA or who had had a child who had died from SMA, and they felt like they really understood what they were going through, but other parents or other friends just didn't understand. So their social connections maybe weren't their social connection was just very different after their child died. So we use these qualitative interviews to develop a survey that measured a range of outcomes for these parents. So the outcomes that we measured in our survey were grief. So using sort of a PG-13 instrument to look at the severity of grief in the parent that we measured, quality of life, physical health, mental health, work productivity, and changes of interest, which sounds like a very broad category, but this came out of the qualitative interviews where parents talked about not only, of course, all of the hard things that they've been through, but some of the, you could think of as some positive aspects that came out of the experience, like their involvement in the SMA community and giving back to the community. And to Rick's point, these were all outcomes that came from the qualitative interviews that were really important to parents, that were things that they said, yeah, this is really what impacted us. And so we used that information to guide our choice in these outcome measures. So we sent a survey to 880 bereaved parents who were in the Cure SMA database, and I'm going to show today the preliminary data from 40 responses that we received. We did receive finally, after several months of data collection, I think a total of around 75 responses. I have to say, following this, I did learn a lot about better ways that we could have tried to reach out or better connect with these parents. I think we spend so much time developing a questionnaire, but we often don't think about how are we really connecting with these parents to explain to them, you know, the purpose of the survey and honestly why it's worth their time to be giving us this information. And part of that came from me attending the Cure SMA conference, where I got to talk to some parents who hadn't filled out the questionnaire and got to understand a little bit of why they did it. So I'm first going to show the results of our health-related quality of life that's we measure with the SF-12 scale. So as a lot of you might know, this is a scale that's measured from 0 to 100, where higher scores are better. There's a population norm of 50, so all these measures are already compared to population norms. So first I'm going to show the results for physical health, and we stratified these in terms of two groups. So parents of children who had died less than 10 years ago, or parents of children who died more than 10 years ago. So parents whose children died less than 10 years ago, you can see they were right around the population norm for their physical health, and same for parents who died more than 10 years ago. So there wasn't a big impact on their physical health. Where you really do see the bigger impact, as you might expect, is reduction in the mental health of these parents for children who died less than 10 years ago. And then this does approach back up to population norms for parents of children who died more than 10 years ago. And I'm not going to present some other results that we did on anxiety and depression, but I'll say that the anxiety scores were really high in these parents, which is really what was driving this this mental health impact that you're seeing here. We also looked at the work limitations of these parents using the work limitation questionnaire. So what I'm going to show you here is a proportion of time that parents experience limitations while working over the past 2 weeks. So this is only among parents that are working. But just to understand here, a higher number here is unfavorable because it means that parents, the respondents experience more limitations at work. So this is the proportion of time that they were experiencing limitations. And again, I'm going to stratify this in terms of physical tasks and then mental interpersonal tasks. So our population norm here was around 9% for the average person. That's weighted by the age and gender of this population. So for parents who children died less than 10 years ago, they had about a 29% physical work limitations, which you can see is much higher than the population norm. And this did decrease to closer to the population norm for parents who children died more than 10 years ago. For the mental interpersonal tasks, population norm was around 10% limitations. You can see that for parents of children who died less than 10 years ago, it was much higher than this. And then it did decrease back down to around population norms for parents whose children died more than 10 years ago. So you can certainly see that things are improving for these parents, but especially for parents within that first 10 years, there are significant limitations, both for their work and the quality of life, as I showed. So the key findings here is that grief negatively impacts parents' quality of life and work productivity, but the impacts do decline over time. Oh, yeah, that's it. That's the end of that piece. But then I want to talk about the next part of this, which is our second question here. So what are the implications for economic evaluations? So what I want to talk about here is how we typically include grief in our conventional quality of life assessments that we do. So right here, I'm going to show sort of a graphical representation of this, where we have time on the horizontal axis. And the vertical axis here is representing our parent outcome. So for this example, I'm going to show this in terms of parent quality of life, but this could be any other outcome. You could think about productivity, mental health outcome, anything like that. So right here, we're going to say that our dashed line here is a population norm for quality of life. And we assume that a child with SMA dies at some point in time, which I've indicated here. And so this traditional CEA assumes that the parent's quality of life is obviously diminished while they're taking care of their child. And that's due to the what we call burden of caregiving, but often just the stress that comes with caregiving. And that's been previously recorded in the literature to be below population norms. So what conventional assessments do is they basically say, well, okay, after the child dies, we're just going to put the parent quality of life back up to the population norm. And that kind of doesn't make sense to anyone who's experienced a family member who passes away. And so what we did is we showed that a more realistic assessment looks something like this, where parents' quality of life is diminished after their child dies, but it does increase then over time. And so the important thing here is that the conventional way that we've been doing these things is not reflecting reality. And the parents really are worse off than population norms after the child dies. And so you can see here that, this really just makes common sense, but this is not the way that things typically had been done, in part just because there wasn't data to do the assessments in a way that better reflected reality. So why does this matter? So conventional assessments make the comparator, that base case, look better than it is in reality. And this is because they don't take into account that when the child dies, not only is that impact on the child, but that the parents then have outcomes associated with their grief following that. And then because it's making that one look better, it diminishes the incremental benefit of a new treatment. It's because it ignores the new treatment not only prolongs the child's life expectancy, but it delays the impact of the grief on the family. And that diminishes the value of the new intervention. So by not taking into account that the new intervention is really delaying grief in the family, it's not taking into account sort of the benefit that has for the child and the family. And so why don't these economic evaluations include grief? There's probably a few reasons for this omission. One is that this is a new concept. This traditional cost effectiveness analyses have really just focused on the child or patient outcomes when the patient is alive, and sort of even a new field in that is incorporating caregiver outcomes. But we really haven't been thinking until recently about what this means after a patient dies. Another big problem is that we don't have data on these outcomes. This is one of the first studies. There are a couple of people in the UK that have also been collecting data on this, and we're submitted an ISPOR panel in Europe to hopefully show some of this. And so some of this is starting to be addressed, but the data now is very, very limited in this area. So what do we need to do? So it's a new concept. So we need to start incorporating grief into economic evaluations for drugs and non-drugs, basically just to show what difference it makes. You know, is this worth doing? In what cases is it worth doing? What can we learn about the importance of collecting these data to include in evaluations? And we need to measure grief in other disease areas. So clearly SMA is not going to represent all diseases, and the benefit of collecting these outcomes in other disease areas is both that they can, of course, be used in those assessments, but I think what we really want to start doing is looking at the variability in outcomes across different disease areas, so we can really see what is driving the difference. You know, is it the patient, is the family's relationship to the patient that impacts grief? Is it the patient's age? Is it the way that they pass away? There's a lot of things that obviously can impact grief in a lot of different ways. And so it would be good to see when these outcomes are consistent across disease areas, or consistent across patient groups, and when they're not consistent. So I want to acknowledge the study team here, especially I want to point out Abby Riley, who presented an earlier version of this presentation at the CEVR April meeting, which was the first time that this was presented, and really grateful for Abby for presenting that work at that meeting. I want to thank Cure SMA for being involved in this study. Scientific Advisory Committee, we had 2 parents, a clinician and an expert in grief research. And back to Rick's point earlier, it's really important that these people were involved from the very beginning and really helped to shape this research. And of course, the study participants. And I'd like to thank Genentech for funding this study. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lavelle. Let me re-share because it looks like it had. I cannot start my video, so I'm going to have to move without my video. Sorry about that. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry about the video. Oh, let's see. There we go. Oh, it was a little tech error. Thank you for fixing that. All right, so I am Brett McQueen, Associate Professor at the University of Colorado. And I'm going to shift a little bit more towards policy and how both the state and federal level might be able to include some of the patient perspectives directly into their decision making, at least using some proposals and applied work that we've done. A big list of people to acknowledge. We've actually been working on this for, I think it was just pre-COVID that we started this project. So it's been going on for a while. I'll speak a little bit at a high level to some of the work that we've published. One note is I am an advisory council member on Colorado's PDAB, but these are just my opinions that I've gained from public meetings. So none of this is directly related to Colorado policy and their opinions. So a lot of the motivation, I think all of us are very aware, of course, of IRA and PDABs with this kind of umbrella objective of cost control for pharmaceuticals. Their sub-objectives are going about it in completely different ways. So negotiations on maximum fair price versus upper payment limits, which I think, at least based on some of the public guidance, they would like to replace something like WAC as a list price. At least that's been the hint through the channels of PDAB circles. They're also facing these pretty significant constraints, a lot of reviews in a very short timeline. And of course, they can't use conventional cost effectiveness. And some of the text like and other measures have really scared a lot of policymakers from using anything with cost effectiveness that includes life years or obviously qualities because they're listed directly, but things like life years, some of the alternative measures like EVLY and HIT, they're even sort of hesitant to use those. But at the same time, they have this attention to at least what ISPOR would call additional value elements in assessments and guidance. Conventionally, I think payers have really struggled with this. There's a great survey that was through AMCP, and Kimberly Westrick, if you know her, led that survey, where they looked at payers that have actually interacted with ICER reports, and they really struggled. Dr. Chapman spoke about this earlier. How do you actually include these perspectives for coverage decisions? So that part I find really fascinating moving forward with CMS and state boards. So what do we mean by additional value elements? So I personally like the iceberg analogy. It's quite simple and it's not directly accurate, but I think it helps understand that, you know, what we're measuring on the surface is really clinical trial related. It's all designed for efficacy, safety, to meet that question, those theoretical questions of can the drug work and can it be used safely. Lurking under the surface is this sort of mix of different perspectives, directly patient related, maybe it's broader and related to society. Maybe some things can be quantified, like severity of disease, right? We have things like shortfalls that can be used to describe severity, whereas novel mechanism of action, you can't really include that in a model quantitative way, or at least the way we currently conduct economic evaluations. Now, CMS isn't using the term additional patient or additional value elements, but they agree that factors like, let's say, adherence, productivity, quality of life, those are all measurable outcomes that often we're including in economic evaluations. But then you look at things like independence, they're sort of abstract, and they follow that up by directly stating, hey, we prefer a qualitative to a formulaic approach for adjusting initial offer starting point. And what they mean with that is we want both sort of discussions with patients, we want discussions with caregivers, with manufacturers, but we also want direct evidence on the drug's impact on outcomes. So it means we need a little bit more of a flexible approach. We're seeing the same thing at the state level. On the far left, you'll see sort of the main factors that they've noted for determining affordability reviews, which is the very first step in PDAP. The second is whether they're going to set an upper payment limit. So this first one is to review very conventional metrics: list price, cost and availability of therapeutic alternatives, patient copays, which, you know, a lot of these, first of all, seem very easy to measure. I think they're actually more difficult. And once you start digging into the data, they can start getting challenging in how you measure those. But in the middle, and what I've highlighted is they still want patient and caregiver input. They want input from people with scientific or medical training. And then on the far right, you'll see these other factors like health equity and then adherence, stuff like that. So they're kind of consistent in, and it makes sense. A lot of the legislation has been borrowed from both the state and federal level, but the way they're actually implementing it in policy is different, but we're still asking, in a sense, for the same things. So this brings me to some of the work we started years ago on extending structured deliberation to include components of multi-criteria decision analysis. So that we're calling group-based stated preference elicitation, because we're not actually using scoring functions, but we're still doing ranking and weighting exercises for priority setting. And the example below, some of you actually were at this meeting in Colorado back in, I think it was 2022, where we took more of a plan member perspective and said, what matters at a societal level? What are the priorities around additional value elements that we should really be generating new evidence on? What is important to people that we should really be paying attention to? And a lot of that is geared towards, at least input to the task force, the HTAI and ISPOR task force on deliberative processes. They have a section in there on prioritization. So a lot of this is related to that. But we actually started this in rare disease years ago and tried to understand, can we use a sort of mixed methods group-based framework to understand what's important to patients. And the results, I think, were surprising to the team members that, we had these added benefits that we didn't really predict. So, for example, one of those was when you're in a group and you're in rare disease, we had patients that had never met another patient with their disease. So then it led to this recall of, oh, that happened to me as well. They exchanged phone numbers, they followed up, and then now they have this network of people. That's just an added benefit that we thought was so important, especially in rare disease. And of course, there are other benefits as well that you can see in the paper. It's open access, so you can read that. But it's really allows us to both quantify what matters, but then also not leave behind the qualitative factors that I think are just as important. I like to explain this approach as focus group meets discrete choice experiment. It's very pragmatic. It's in between, say, a discrete choice experiment and a focus group in terms of the bias of those opinions and perspectives in a group setting. So after our publications, we actually worked directly with PDAB, and they said, hey, we need to create more of a transparent way. We have a ton of drugs that are up for an affordability review, but we don't want to just go in and pick and choose. We want to be somewhat consistent with how we're choosing drugs. And I said, okay, well, we've got something that we can try. Let's give it a shot. And then you can actually watch the live recording if you're interested in understanding how this process works. We did it in under 2 hours and had them at least rank and weight the conventional factors that I showed on the far left-hand side of that earlier slide. And it's just for setting priorities for sorting drugs. So we're not scoring drugs in a way that we would be setting upper payment limits, but it's more to pare down the list of what's most important to the board, which is then a reflection of all the public comments and the engagement from Coloradans here in the state. They chose to move forward with contextual factors only at a qualitative level, although we did suggest we could do at least 2 parts, right? One that is more directly related to the legislation, and then others that ranks and weights the contextual factors. All right, so now kind of moving on to CMS, and for those of you who were at ISPOR in Atlanta and saw the session, I'm sorry for the repeat information, but I think kind of merging the federal and the state level is important here. So we wrote this paper in context to the Pharma Foundation Challenge Award. We unfortunately didn't win, but I think it was nice to get our idea down on paper, and the idea is that we'll actually be implementing this in the next year. And I'll start first with our main figure and walk through it. So start on the left-hand side for step 1, which would be an assessment of conventional comparative effectiveness. So this goes back to the added benefit, the initial price offer, and any sort of adjustments that we would make to the offer with patient experience. So just to kind of set the stage. And this first step is your typical P&T committee. It's what we're already used to in the United States. Physicians, pharmacists, nurses, clinical specialists, et cetera. And we could come to 3, possibly even more, categorical ratings of substantial, minor, no or less added benefit. Behind the scenes, of course, we're not really prescribing the evidence to be presented here, but think of all the different risks and benefits over a long time period with real experience with the drug. And then that would be linked directly to the prices. So in the case of substantial benefit, you can imagine, this is already working really well for everyone involved. There's a reason why it's being used a lot. Let's just end the process and be very efficient. But the more of the nuances in the minor or no or less added benefit. Why is this drug being used? Why is it preferred by patients? And we can attach that more to the weighted average price of the alternatives or the price of the lowest cost alternative. Then that would shift to step 2, where we could actually imagine the deliberative committee being patients, caregivers, representatives, and that would be assessment not only of existing evidence among peers, but also their own experience, where they would directly be voting for the minor or substantial or no or less added benefit to adjust that starting point. And I'll show you on the next figure how we actually can propose to adjust the price. But those would be linked directly. And then this would be an actual, patients will actually be involved in this step of adjusting the price, explicit involvement of patient decisions. Then if we were to move more to the pricing figure, so you see, first of all, on the left-hand side, this would be the starting point. And then really we've highlighted 4 scenarios that are not comprehensive. We understand there are more scenarios, but 1 and 3 would be scenarios where there's really no added patient experience benefit. And you would just move directly to the weighted average price of the alternatives and the price of the lowest cost alternative. In scenario 2 and 4, you run into this, well, an upward adjustment because there's a minor or substantial added patient experience benefit. So now we adjust that initial price offer upward. We have received a couple of questions that, hey, are there any cases where there would be a downward adjustment? It's certainly possible. We don't know walking into this scenario whether that would be possible, but I think I just, as a group, we struggled to find cases where a drug would be used often enough that it would be up for negotiation, so beneficial on the conventional comparative effectiveness, but just not at all helpful on patient experience. I'm sure they're out there. We've thought of like a few rare cases, but we just weren't necessarily sure whether they would actually be up for negotiation. Okay, so that's kind of the CMS application. And to wrap it up, there are a lot of advantages that we found. There are also some disadvantages. First, having sort of loose decision rules. So that's categorical ratings. That could be priority setting with ranking and weighting. Really improves definitely the transparency, the consistency if applied correctly, but it also preserves this sense of flexibility where we have the sort of qualitative and the quantitative factors all moving together. How do we bring this all together into our decision making? There are some feasibility concerns. So in the CMS context specifically, but also applicable to PDABs, there could be drugs that have a ton of different indications. Are we really going to get representativeness across all of the indications? No, obviously not. But I think the point is, that's going to be a problem either way, no matter what framework you use. So the point is to try to just involve some of those folks in the decision-making problem, the end user of the indication of the particular drug directly into decision-making. So in our view, this is very complementary work. There's other groups doing this, obviously. The other 2 speakers that have done some great work in patient engagement and value assessment. But the idea around a reproducible and efficient framework really can be helpful for incorporating patient perspectives. We've seen it directly. We're hoping that it gets used more because it's been really helpful for our own research and even policy work. Our future work from here includes, we're actually going to be using the framework for different decision contexts like priority setting for unmet need, since that is obviously a hot topic with CMS. And then we are still working on whether we can randomize and test our framework versus focus groups alone. So I'll end there. I know we have some discussion and welcome any questions. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks to all of our speakers for wonderful presentations. We are now entering into the Q&A section. We have just a few minutes left in today's session. Thank you to those who have entered questions into the chat. I'll start by reading a couple of them. The first is to Rick, and I'll read it verbatim. It seems like the connection between scientific spillovers and rare disease is somewhat incongruous, given that many in the rare disease community feel that the experience is so unique to their disease that it's hard to consider a technology platform that can translate across conditions. Did this come up in your discussions?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm glad we got this question because I think it is important to acknowledge that tension between the uniqueness of each disease and the patient's experience of that disease, while we're still trying to look for commonalities across diseases. And in fact, when we first started talking about this project with people, I thought we were going to get laughed out of the room because they would say, you can't look for commonalities, everything's unique. But people really were open to looking for that and recognize that, yes, there's a subset that's going to be unique, but there's a subset that may cut across, and it's important to maybe differentiate those. And in terms of spillover, I think it kind of could cut both ways, but the example I really think about is part of the reason why we started thinking about this project was cell and gene therapies. You know, a lot of rare diseases have a genetic basis. And cell and gene therapy, once that platform is set up and has proved itself in hitting a particular target, you know, often you can just change the genetic target and repurpose that technology for other diseases. And so, you know, I think there is a chance for some real spillover, especially with some of these new revolutionary treatments.
Great, thank you. Tara, I think the next one is for you. Is there any concern about double counting grief if it also reflects in mental health outcomes for parents? Since any counseling or treatment parents receive may also impact their mental health, and those could be the subject of their own economic evaluations.
I'm not sure I totally understand the question.
In terms of double counting, right? So quality of life might be measured in multiple ways, especially as it relates to mental health. This says, since any counseling or treatment parents receive may also impact their mental health, and those could be the subject of their own economic evaluation.
Oh, I see. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So, yeah, I do think that there's obviously, you know, we struggle a lot with this, just even when children are alive, in economic evaluations that include caregiver impacts, because oftentimes parents really have trouble separating their own quality of life and their child's quality of life. And this has been discussed a lot in the field. I think in terms of what you mentioned in terms of an intervention, I think that can be its own separate question. You know, maybe there are parents who would benefit from that, and that could be, you know, a separate intervention that could be, you know, compared to, you know, there could be several different alternatives for that, and the parent quality of life would be an outcome measure. I do also want to bring up that something like quality of life in anxiety and depression, there is absolutely overlap with those. And really what I want to start getting to is not just looking at, you know, cost per quality, like this is the only outcome measure. I think we can say this is the cost of the intervention. Here's how it impacts qualities. Here's how, if we just looked at anxiety, is how it impacted it. If we just looked at depression, if we just looked at productivity, right? Like, no, there's overlap, but start looking at these things together and use this as a holistic decision-making process. You know, we don't have to put everything into one number. And I think that's sometimes where people got into double counting, was like, let's try to stick everything into one number and do a cost per quality. Like, I'm not really in favor of that as a decision-making rule anymore. I really think that these are all separate outcomes that can be looked at sort of in a row, more of a cost consequence analysis than we've traditionally been doing.
And I think that's a great answer, because that was certainly one of my questions, is not only what's the best way to collect data, but then how do you incorporate it into meaningful economic evaluations?
Yeah, and I mean, I think all this stuff, you know, comes down to, like, everyone wants a threshold, everyone wants to put all these things into a cost per quality. But as soon as we start, you know, putting like 5 different outcomes into a cost per quality, like, what do we have anymore? There is no threshold anymore, you know? So I think, you know, we're sometimes just trying to make everything work into a framework that, you know, was developed in 1980. And, you know, maybe that's just not what we need to be doing anymore. Like, maybe as a field, we just all need to step back and say, like, hey, we all have different ways, like, you know, back to some of like Dr. McQueen's work, you know, there's a lot of different factors here. There's different ways that you can weight these things. There's different ways that we can value these things in other methods. And we don't need to put everything into a cost per quality framework. And that may not be a popular opinion, or maybe it is, but that's sort of where I'm moving to in my work.
Perfect, thank you. And Professor McQueen, question for you. One that also interests me as I think about cost effectiveness analysis, but how can we use MCDA practically, as we might need CEA thresholds for decision making?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you imagine almost like a value dossier, where you can have cost per whatever, right? Cost per outcome. Maybe we don't like quality, maybe it's cost per life year gained. What if you had a whole patient and caregiver experience sort of chapter and you had actual quantitative results, either implemented in the framework that I had explained for CMS, or in some way that you're actually bringing in the patient perspective. I mean, that's the most practical way. And not to mention, we also did this with the state board, and that was quite practical. I mean, that flew right into drug sorting decisions. So I guess where I'm going with this is, I think in the end, MCDA and a lot of us have come to the same conclusion. You're going to be stuck with the same problem that you already were with cost per quality. What's the threshold of difference between the new treatment and then some comparator? You have to decide what's actually beneficial. So you're just right back to where you started. We're much better off using sort of components of MCDA to help us make decisions, rather than sort of a formal threshold idea. So.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we are just about at time. I do want to thank our panel members, Rick, Tara, and Brett, for your excellent presentations today. I would like to also thank the CEVR folks again for hosting and coordinating today's event in collaboration with the ISPOR Boston chapter. And Patty, I don't know if you have any closing words, but again, thank you to all who attended as well.
No, just to echo your comments, Matt. Thank you to everybody involved.
Thanks all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.